Thank you for coming for our first public program of the new academic year. So we're thrilled to have Barbara MacCallum here and her husband, Bob Johnson. I've known them both since I've been director of the University of Virginia Art Museum, so that's close to 20, we know too long, 20 years or whatever, and have followed her work, which has been very consistent, but keeps going in kind of consistent, but also expansive. And it's been a long time for me in wanting to show Barbara's work here, so I'm thrilled that we can do it. And it's made possible because some of you may have heard last year, we received an endowment, a fund, which is now the Hearts Fund for Contemporary Art. So that has made a lot of things possible that were not possible before, including this beautiful catalog. So I don't know if you've seen it yet, but it's for this exhibition and has just beautiful images in it, and also an essay by Amelia Anderson, who was a graduate student here and worked with us last year. So I encourage you to pick one of these up on the way out. I'm not going to say a lot about Barbara's background. In fact, nothing other than it's an honor to show your work and to have you in Eugene, because she's going to start with some of that. She is from Ireland, which you can tell from the accent probably, and has been living in mostly Charlottesville, but doing various things from teaching, managing art departments, and making art. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Barbara MacCallum.
So I've talked to many of you yesterday, and you know that I come from Ireland. I come from Belfast in Northern Ireland, and many of you have heard about the political situation there, but what you may not know is that Belfast at one point was the capital of the textile industry in Britain. Big textile mills, big linen industry. You know, you may have a tea towel at home that has an Irish donkey on it. Those sorts of things all come from Belfast. And when I was growing up in schools, all of us, boys and girls, all had to do as part of our curriculum sewing, knitting, embroidery. Of course, we all hated it, me included. We thought it's got nothing to do with, being in school. In fact, I was kept in once every day for a week because I was knitting a sock on 4 needles and I couldn't turn the heel. And so I stayed in after class in detention trying to turn this heel. So those sorts of things are guaranteed to turn you off crafts or any sort of hand-making thing. But anyway, when I finished high school, I went to the Ulster College of Art and Design in Belfast, and there I was put in the textile department. It's not where I wanted to be. It was the last place I wanted to be. But in Britain, often you have no choices. You go where they place you, and the textile department was the most influential because of the industry there. And so I learned to like it. I still knew that I wasn't quite happy in that program, especially since one day a month, all of us textile students were placed in a weaving shed with huge looms with people whose career was weaving fabrics, and they dreaded us coming, and we hated being there because the what do you call it? The shuttles were like miniature bombs. You know, you pressed a button and they whizzed across, and you pressed a button and they stopped. But often the students forgot, me included, to press the button to stop, and so it would wham with its metal point into the next loom. So we were very, very unpopular. But these were very, very early computers, jacquard looms. And I mean, if I'd only been more sophisticated, the work that I saw there was really pretty interesting. But I was bored, as all the students were bored. And then one day a month, I was in a silkscreen printing factory, learning how Irish tea towels, and a tea towel is a drying cloth, usually made of linen in Ireland and Britain anyway. And my job was to silkscreen the little yellow straw hat on the donkey as he pulled the load of peat. And you can imagine how insulting that was to a student who thought she was going to be an artist. So I knew for sure that I wanted nothing to do with textiles per se. But I did my undergraduate degree there. I did a graduate degree. I started teaching. And then I met this man who I thought was extremely weird. He was the first American I had ever met. He had a funny voice, and he dressed in funny clothes, and he came to Belfast to do a postdoc at Queen's University in physics. We met, and we sort of hovered around each other, and eventually we fell in love, and the last thing I wanted to do was to have anything to do with science, because science was one of the subjects I actually hated in school. As well as textiles. But anyway, he tried to get a job. When he finished his postdoc, he tried to get a job in Ireland and couldn't. His research is pretty obscure. He's a theoretician, and he deals with space, like an astrophysicist. He deals with moons of Jupiter and planets, and you can imagine in Ireland it's a little difficult to get a job in that. And so he got a job at Southern Illinois University and left Ireland, and I stayed on because I had a great teaching position. And after about 6 months, I joined him at Southern Illinois University, and I started teaching part-time in the fiber department there. And that was fine, except after maybe a month, I got a letter from the Dean of Fine Arts saying that I wasn't qualified to teach, and I had to stop immediately. So I went to see him, and the chairman of my department, we went together and said, why am I not qualified? And he said, because he had looked at my transcripts, and on it he could see both my undergraduate and my graduate work. I didn't have any course in American history. And so because of that, I was not qualified. So little did he know I never had a course in high school or any time in American history, because Belfast is part of the British system, and the British don't believe that America has any history, right? So all we study is dead kings and queens and beheadings and wars. Rather boring. But anyway, I couldn't teach anymore. But the work that was going on in the art department there was of great interest to me. And so I decided to do an MFA. And I did an MFA, a Master of Fine Arts, in textiles. And I also did a lot of sculpture and drawing, because the system in America is so much freer than it is in Britain, and I was able to do exactly as I wanted. So around this time, there was great upheaval in America. This was in the early 70s. And as you know, Belfast is in constant upheaval. So I am used to that. I feel very comfortable in that. In fact, when I left New York, I live half the year in Virginia and half the year in New York. So I left New York to come to here, and there were hurricanes whizzing up the East Coast, as you've seen. And then I left hurricanes to come over here to fires. So in both places, I feel pretty comfortable. But anyway, the women's movement was under full swing, civil rights movement, anti-war movement, and I became so interested as a foreign country and a foreigner in this country in all those movements, and especially in the women's movement. A lot of revisionist history went on, where both men and women historians looked back at the role of minorities in history. The fact that women, for example, had not been allowed to study art at art colleges, had been deliberately kept away, and when they were admitted, they were not allowed to study from the naked figure, either male or female, because the powers that be decided, all men of course, decided that our constitutions were too weak and we couldn't possibly stand up to seeing any nude bodies. In fact, it was just a way of keeping us out of the competition. So these revisionist historians sort of unearthed all of this, and of course we sort of vaguely knew it, but historians do such a wonderful job of bringing things together that we vaguely know and presenting it in an easy way. And so a lot of pressure was brought on the major museums in New York to include women artists, which they reluctantly started doing. And one of the big things was a quilt show, excuse me, at the Whitney Museum. Now, quilts were things that women were permitted to make, and in the Midwest, some really beautiful quilts were made. They were appropriate because, from the man's point of view, they kept women in the home. They were doing something that kept their families warm, and these quilts, for the most part, were made out of shredded clothing from their families, so it wasn't expensive. And so all of that was fine, but it was not considered art. But the Whitney, under pressure, put up this show of really beautiful quilts, and I went to the Whitney to see this show, and it really was beautiful. But the thing that struck me most clearly was that although the quilt was, stunning, underneath the label said, quilt from Columbus, Ohio, say, the date, and then under that it said artist unknown. But in fact, the artist, the woman who made it, had often signed the quilt or embroidered the name on the quilt, or a group of women had done it and all their names were on the quilt. But every label in beautiful museum style said artist unknown. So the historians had a heyday on this, and this sort of started me off. And I started doing a series on quilts. But I didn't want a traditional quilt. I wanted to do a quilt that was done with male materials. Around this time, I was a visiting artist at the Art Institute of Chicago, and Bob and I couldn't afford, he was doing research part-time at the University of Chicago, and we couldn't afford a studio for me, so we lived in very small quarters. And living together for a year in those small quarters, I realized that I was actually living with the enemy. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but he was so well treated compared with me. I was receiving invitations to give a talk somewhere, and the honorarium was $100. No airfare paid there and back. Bob was invited to give a talk, and the honorarium was $5,000, and the way paid there and back, and an apology that they couldn't put him in first class, he would have to be in business class. And my mouth would drop open, and I realized that instead of looking for materials that I felt were male, I was thinking of hard materials like aluminum, and I did some work in that. I realized that it was his materials that actually I should be using. And many people here are old enough to remember when faxes were the quickest way of communication. And so I took all the faxes that he received in a week, and I made this quilt. This is a side view and a close-up. And you may know that faxes, if you remember, are quite fugitive. So the writing, the black and white science that was written on it, which was very clear when I made the quilt, within a month, it had faded, and in the meantime, I had drawn on top of the quilt with the tip of an iron. I had washed part of them. I had sewn them with Irish linen. So what I essentially did, and what I'm still doing, is taking men's work, taking science as a metaphor for men's work, and turning it into women's work by doing traditionally what has been associated with women, such as washing, wringing dry, ironing, putting things in the oven, burning. So I do all of those as Bob publishes his papers, and he's quite prolific, so I have great choices, and I then do those things to turn it into women's work. So what you're looking at are marks that I made early on in the quilt, and then this is the quilt about a month later, where all the science disappeared and all the art marks were prominent. So it sort of achieved my purpose, and at the same time, it was a quilt made of 3 layers of faxes that I had backed in gauze that I had stained red. The next piece I did was fur quilts. The title of the piece is Atomic and Molecular Collisions, which is what Bob is noted for. And here I took the paper, I multiplied it, I copied it, I Xeroxed it in those days. I whitewashed out parts of the science that I didn't like, and I left parts that I did like. I sewed it together, and then I took it outside, and I burned it quite aggressively with a plumber's torch. At this point, somebody always says, it's amazing you're still married. But in fact, we've been married a long time, and Bob is a frustrated artist and is very interested in my work. So I backed it then with fur. This is fake fur that I stained with acrylic paint, and I burned it again. And so I had a heyday outside, sort of burning with this plumber's torch. And then I sewed it all together again with Irish linen, and then I rolled it up to sort of humanize it and keep it warm. Science is a very cold, linear, male-oriented field. I don't like it any better now than I did then, but it serves a great purpose for my work. This is about 8 feet across, maybe 8 feet across and 6 feet tall. And it's a detail, a little hard to see. I sewed on top of it with heavy crude jute, which is like a type of linen, and then painted over that. This one then is wire quilt, and I took the last pages of many of the papers that he had published, and the last pages always say discussion and conclusion. And who knows what the conclusion is or what the discussion is, but it seemed to me a really nice title for a piece. And so I took several layers of the paper. I painted and stained with acrylic, blues and reds and different colors. I glued them all together, I sewed them together, I took them outside and I burned them. I should say I sewed them onto wire. You can see it's sort of quite crude wire. And so the burning again was my burning out of parts of the science that I didn't like and leaving in the parts that made sense. This is the title of a book that he wrote, Introduction to Atomic and Molecular Collisions, second edition. It's the second part of the first part that he wrote. I put the titles in underneath. You know, it's not usual in art to put titles in, but the titles here are important to the work. And what's more, I can never remember them anyway, but some of them as they go on become quite obscure. But I was listening to him giving a talk, and there was a big audience, and he was using overhead projector. Do you remember overhead projectors? With acetates, transparencies on top. And my job afterwards was to collect these transparencies and carry them home. But in the meantime, I was sitting in the back row of his talk, you know, quite bored, listening to all this stuff, and my mind started drifting, and I saw all these little bodies sort of flying out of a quilt. You know, I'd been making, for every one quilt I'm showing you, there were maybe 2 or 3 that I'm not showing. And so I still couldn't get away from the quilt format, but I saw these sort of bodies. The slides are not very good, unfortunately. And I made these bodies when I went back to the studio. I brought all the transparencies with me, and then I made bodies from the actual paper. I sort of washed them, I wrung them dry, I put them in the oven, I burned them, and they're little abstract figures about 1 foot high. And here they are, sort of flying out. And then I moved away from the quilt format. And this title of this piece made me think of this piece. This piece is about 15 feet high. Collisional ejection from an atmosphere. So the title of the paper. And that made me clearly think of a body. You know, I liked the little bodies I did previously, but I wanted to make a larger one. And it's still a sort of an abstract body. So I made this body, and then over it I took a lot of acetates that I tied together with wire, I think in this case. And there's also some burning. You can see the body sort of falling, being ejected from what I thought of was a cloud. This is the piece where Jill and I sort of met or got to know each other well. It was part of a show that she curated at the University of Virginia. And it was about Thomas Jefferson. This is called The Metamorphosis of a Scientific Article, produced in Mr. Jefferson's University in the year 2000, which was the year that I made this piece. And I was getting more and more aggressive with human bodies, and I took Bob's body himself, and I started casting his body with plaster bandages that you use when you have a broken arm. And then I covered them with fake fur, burned it heavily, and stuck his papers in different places. The background is still a sort of a quilt with fur that I put here and there to try and think of disintegration and radiation. Because the title of the piece, the title of the paper that I used was actually Radiation from the Surface of the Moon of Jupiter or something like that. So here are the bodies looking like they're disintegrating. I burned a CD of Bob reading the paper, and I placed the speaker behind the backdrop. And so when you walked into the space, you saw this whole area of disintegration, not very pleasant, and then his voice coming in a very sort of muted, dull, boring way. I made him practice reading the paper in a very boring way before I recorded it, and that came from the backdrop. So this is a close-up. And then I moved from that to trying to do a much more clearly defined image of the body. And so I did, these are 3 different moods of Bob, and 3 different moods of how artists and scientists work together. You know, we work in isolation. We can be quite depressed and then quite happy about the way things are going. and then hopefully have some sort of reward at the end of it. And so these are actual casts of his body. And somebody always says, how long does it take? And wasn't he bored? And the answer is yes, he's very bored sitting. And I play a book on tape for him, or he watches television or whatever. And it takes about 5 hours to do the whole body. And it's not cast very well because I'm not expert at it, but it's important to me that my hand is on the work and that it's Bob's work. Because all of this work is a portrait of our marriage. It's my work and Bob's work and coming together and making something different. I'm also interested in androgyny, not male, not female, certainly nothing too male, too macho, nothing too feminine, but the gap in the middle. And so it's moving to that gap in the middle that interests me. And so the first part of this is the title of the paper, Stimulated Desorption of Atoms and Molecules from Bodies in the Outer Solar System. And so one of the bodies represents loneliness and depression. And I think you can see, well, it's not this one, I better go back again. You can see which body looks depressed. And then one of them represents happiness. I made a sort of a fiesta skirt, and you can see which one that is. And then the third body with the cape and the arms out represents success. Because at this point, Bob received an honorary doctorate from the University of Uppsala in Sweden. And I went with him, and we spent a week in Uppsala. And for both of us, it was one of the most amazing weeks of our life, in that for that week, the whole of the town of Uppsala shut down. There were celebrations every night. There was a professor at the University of Uppsala, which is one of the oldest universities in Europe. His doctorate was in etiquette. And he made sure that everybody did the right thing at the right time. In fact, we received, while we were still in America, we received maybe 6 letters telling us what to wear on each day, how to behave, how to be introduced, how Bob should introduce me, how I should be introduced to a fellow person who was getting the honorary doctorate as opposed to somebody who was not getting the honorary doctorate. And every night there was a banquet in a different castle, beautiful old castles, lit only by thousands of candles. And we were told what to wear. And so in my letter, it said I had to wear a formal evening gown. Well, those of you who have seen me yesterday, I sort of dress like this all the time. I don't own a dress or a skirt, never mind a formal evening gown. And so my friends rallied round, and somebody gave me a long, sort of slim dress that pulled up. And somebody else gave me a little fur cape because I knew the castle had no central heating and I was going to freeze. And so I wore that. And I really looked, I was sort of pleased with the way I looked. Bob thought I looked good. My friends thought I looked good. But when we went to these banquets, I looked so wrong, so terrible. The women were all wearing crinolines, dresses that practically had hoops underneath. They had low necklines with the family jewels around them. Many of them wore tiaras. Many of them wore long white gloves. All the dignitaries, not all, but many of the dignitaries from Europe were there, royal people with, aristocratic roots. It was very, very impressive, except for me. I looked so different. And Bob did his bit. He would introduce me. He wore a top hat that they gave him and tails. And he would introduce me to people, and he'd say whatever he was told to say. And then at the end, he would say, and she's an artist. And after he did that a few times, I said to him, why do you say that? You weren't told. You're not supposed to be saying that. And we looked at each other and we started laughing because it was clear he was trying to explain why I looked so odd that I was an artist. But anyway, that was an amazing occasion, and it obviously had a great effect on me. And so I made this piece that has the cape. So this is the fiesta one. This is the rejoicing. And as I said, this is the way artists work, and it's the way clearly scientists work. And I should point out that Bob is not a person who has a lab. He's a theoretician. So he just thinks. We all make fun of him that he just looks into space and gets paid. So artists, I'm alone in the studio working. He's alone on his computer working. And out of it comes results, some of them good and some of them not so good. So these are the papers. He made a paper called, what was this title? Atomic and Molecular Collisions? No, whatever it's called. Anyway, that it was in 3 parts. And this is page 2, and this is page 3, and this is the honorary doctorate one. Now you notice they all have straps, excuse me, straps going up to the ceiling, and in these straps I put wires. So each body is wired up, and there's a speaker inside the belly of each body, and there's a sensor in the ceiling. So I burned a CD, excuse me, I burned a CD of Bob reading all 3 pages, and I played that at a very low level. So when you walked into the gallery, you could hear this rather boring, again, voice reading this sort of science text. And you know, it's not in English. You can barely understand what it is. So it immediately takes you into another world. And then as you walk up close to the body, somebody would walk up and suddenly the belly starts talking, and this belly started talking page 1. So Bob read only page 1, and I put the speaker in here, and it was all wired up to somewhere behind the wall, so you'd see everybody jump as the second voice came on. And then if they went to the second body, third body, etc., all the voices came on, and yet again the science blurred. You know, the science which might have made sense to a scientist at one point, at the end they were all talking over each other. So again, the art was dominant and the science was secondary. So it took me so long to make those 3 bodies, you know, and it's sort of boring making them, you know, and Bob was bored and I was bored. I just knew I really wanted them. So I thought I'd better reuse them and not ask him to do that again. So I'd always wanted to do something that didn't have a science title. So this is called A Marriage of Art and Science. And the large body is the bride, and the other 2 bodies are the bridesmaids. And Bob shows his classes at the University of Virginia, where he teaches every spring semester. And every fall semester, he has an office at NYU where he does research. And I have a studio nearby in Soho. And so he shows his students these beautiful movies that come from NASA. I mean, really beautiful spaceships and moons. And so I took 2 of these videos, and I projected one on the front of this bride's skirt and one on the back. And I put them out of sync. So the narrator's voice, which is very nice, but by the time they're out of sync, again, the science is jumbled. And you see the images slightly differently, but overall, all around the skirt, the science images have sort of broken up because you can't read them as science anymore, and they've turned into beautiful textile patterns. So I mentioned my early upbringing in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, because although when somebody would ask me if I thought being Irish had affected my work, you know, I would always flippantly say, no, you know, I'm not an Irish artist, I'm not an American artist, I'm just an artist. But as I got older, I realized that my background in textiles played a major role in what I did. All of these are sewn, but they're sewn in such a way that it's sort of crude. You know, it's not, textile artists would not think this was related to textiles because it's just too ugly. In fact, around this time, I received a phone call from a person who was organizing a national textile conference. And she said to me, she knew me a little, and she said over the phone, you know, we're looking for a keynote speaker. And we asked somebody, and she couldn't do it. So we're looking for a backup. So I thought, well, you know, I'll be a backup. And then she said, you know, our committee who was choosing the person, we got together after our first choice turned us down and thought, well, what we really need is something different. We need to have a person whose work nobody likes. And we all thought of you. So as I say, she knew me a little, so she knew I would think that was amusing. So I did go, and I was the keynote speaker, and it did cause a major upheaval because half the people there thought this had nothing to do with textiles, and their money had been wasted, and you can imagine. Anyway, so this is part of the imagery that you see, and I also put the lighting in such a way that the whole thing looked a little bit ominous. And if you see my show downstairs, you see the lighting does a little bit of the same thing. And I'm interested in sort of things not being exactly as they look, you know, things moving and moving into another level. So these are the bridesmaids, and you recognize the body on the right as the depressed one from the previous one. Well, this time I put them the right way up, and I made skirts for them with wire hoops. And I think that came from being in Sweden as well, looking at these women sashaying around in their hoop petticoats. It was sort of amazing, sort of like 50 years out of date. And then I put transparencies from overhead projectors. I didn't burn them this time. I just sewed them onto the wire. And these are the two bridesmaids. And then I got an invitation to go to the University of Western Australia as a visiting artist. There is a group there that you could look up online if you're interested. They're called Symbiotica, Symbiotica. And it's a young couple from Israel, actually, who are artists. And after they did their national service, they looked around for a place somewhere in the world that was totally isolated, that nobody would pay any attention to what they did. And they came up with Perth, Australia. You know, it's the only city on the west coast of Australia. And they moved there, and they went to the art department, and they showed their work, and they said, you know, we'd be interested if you want us. And the art department wanted nothing to do with them. They went to the science department, and the science department said, come on, we have space for you. They do very odd work. They're interested, and it is controversial work, they're interested in taking tissue from living organisms and growing it into sculpture. So right there, you would think, ooh, creepy. But because it was creepy, I was sort of interested in it. And so they take proposals from artists around the world that you could come and work with them for 3 months. And so I wrote to them and I said, you know, I've been dealing with the exterior of my my husband's body for so many years, and now I would like to deal with his interior. And they wrote back and said, yeah, come on. And I thought, oh my goodness, you know, what am I going to do? So anyway, I should explain that they had just come at that point from a big show in Paris, which was featured in the New York Times. This is maybe 15 years ago. They, in the gallery that they were showing their work, they hired a local restaurant, a fancy one apparently, to come and set up a dining table for the two of them, the Israeli couple. And there were 2 chairs, and it was all set up with a beautiful white tablecloth. And at one side of the table, the artist made a glass case. And in that case were little green frogs dancing around. On the other side of the table, they put a totally enclosed case. And in that, they grew a frog steak. And at the end of the month, the maitre d' from the local restaurant came with his napkin over his arm, and he served them. They sat there, and they were videotaped, and he served them haricot vert and pomme de terre and frog steak, and they ate the meal. And the frog steak, they took tissues from the live frogs, and they grew it over a shape that they thought looked like a T-bone steak. And at the end of the month, there was an actual steak. And so they were making a statement about it's possible to eat steak without killing the animals because the frogs were still alive. And so it's got great publicity in the art world. Some people thinking it was just too creepy or disgusting, and many people, me included, thinking it was absolutely amazing. They also took tissue from a mouse, and they made a little armature like a coat, and they put the tissue over the armature and made a little coat for the mouse, and the mouse wore the coat, and they displayed the mouse for a short time in a nice environment. While I was there, I don't think they were so interested in my work because mine was sort of mundane compared with everyone else's. But while I was there was an artist from Spain, as a visit, came for 3 months like I did, and she, a woman, she took tissue from herself, and she made herself a set of earrings and a necklace. And she wore them. And I mean, it is a little odd, right? But anyway, that's the sort of stuff they do. So when I got there, they set me up with a biologist and another scientist, and they showed me how to take videos of Bob's blood and his breath in his veins and other sorts of weird things that was going on inside him. And I did that, and then I came home, and then I worked in the studio, and then I went back for another 3 months the following year, and another 3 months the year after that. And of course, I planned it carefully that I went there when it was winter here, and it was summer there, and it was absolutely beautiful. So anyway, that's the main thing I remember, how amazing it was to step into such beautiful summer in the midst of our winter. So unfortunately, you can't see this very well, but again, you recognize the sort of thing that is Bob's body. And the video of blood cells I projected onto the skirt. But you can't see it. The photographer, he tried, and then I got another photographer. Nobody could capture it because of the quality of, I don't know, the blood in the cells or whatever. But there was this bright red, sort of skinny line that would sort of leap around, like you'd think he was dying one minute, and then he was all excited. This is the blood in the veins. And then the front of the body, I tucked in a microphone, and that was the noise of the blood in his veins in the front. And then I thought, well, I'm sick of using Bob's body, I'm going to use mine. And I remembered when I was a teenager growing up in Ireland, I used to see all these awful American movies with girls getting ready for proms, wearing prom dresses, and we all used to laugh and think we didn't have such a thing as a prom. We used to think dressing up like that was so American and so ridiculous. But I realized I wanted to make myself a prom dress. So I made an armature of wire over my body, and I took Bob's papers and I burned them, did all the usual stuff. I backed them with wire screening that I got from the hardware store, again, male materials. I burned holes. I sewed all of this onto this armature of my body. This is the inside. I also sewed on red linen. That is sort of a dark red linen that looks like veins or blood or whatever. I sewed that on, and then I burned it all, and I put in the gallery that it was displayed, I had a light source inside. The gallery was pitch black. There was a light inside, and all the holes let the light come out, and so all the way around, it was really sort of nice. It was like a disco ball, so it was like a prom dance, because all these dots all over the ceiling and all over the walls. I also burned his voice reading the paper as well. And then I decided I should be nicer to him and make him a Valentine. And so I made a Valentine out of some paper, I can't remember what. I stuffed it, and I stuffed it with his shredded underwear. And this sort of reminded me of the quilt makers, you know what they did. So I took his handkerchiefs and his T-shirts and everything and shredded them up really fine and stuffed this 3D heart. And then in the center, I put an MRI of his heart. And so at that time, he had a student who was working at the University of Virginia Hospital doing some sort of data thing with the MRI machine, trying to improve it so that the results were more exact. And I was interested in that, so I got Bob to introduce me to her. And I said, would you run Bob through the machine? She said, sure. And I said to Bob, would you run through the machine? He said, yeah, sure. So we went and in the evening when there was nobody around and ran him through the machine. And this is an MRI of the heart. It sort of pulses and makes funny noises. And it was really quite, well, maybe you think that's terrible, but I thought it was funny and interesting. Neither Bob nor I nor the student thought for a second there might be anything wrong with his heart. That might be a shock when we discovered the results. But luckily he was fine. This is a detail. And then I think this is the last slide I'm going to show before I briefly show the slides of the work that is done in the gallery. And I made a shirt. This is the title of one of his papers called Photolysis of a Tailored Structure. And so I immediately thought of sewing and making a shirt. So I measured him and I made this shirt for him. And it's the papers that I washed, did various things to, and then I rubbed. I don't know if you can see here, all those holes is the fabric of the paper weakened. And I looked at all the science that I didn't like, and I rubbed it out with my thumb. It took weeks and weeks and weeks. I wet it, and I rubbed, and I rubbed, and I rubbed. My thumb nearly disappeared. So I got the sort of feeling that I wanted. And then I showed a light behind it. I showed the shirt with a light behind it. So the whole shirt looked like lace. And I forgot to mention early on, but some of those early quilt pieces that went quite wide from left to right, when I burned them deliberately very heavy at one end. I think as you're looking at it, it would have been at the right. And when you burn it very heavily, something nice happens. Well, first of all, the science disappears. That's nice. But secondly, it ends up looking very delicate. It looks like lace. And if it's displayed right and if the lighting is right, there is this very delicate, feminine sort of lace-like effect. And so this shirt ends up looking the same sort of way. And this is one of the pieces that is in the gallery downstairs. the title of the paper, Mechanism for Cloud Spreading in the DSMC Model #1. And then I put an English name at the end of it, vest, so that I could remember what it was and other people could too. And again, I cast Bob's arms this time out in a Christ-like gesture. I covered them with the paper that the title is there. I burned them slightly, and under the arms all the way across I put fake fur, which was white, and I burned it and turned it into sort of a, sort of a melted, viscous sort of material. I gave them hands at the end, and then I made what I call a vest, like a medieval vest, where I took his papers, they're like little cigarettes, and I washed them and wrung them and put matte medium on them, took them outside and burned them, and then I sewed them one by one, very tediously, but sort of all this training that I had in knitting and sewing and crafts, it all came out. You can't seem to avoid what happened to you as you were growing up. So when I teach my students, they all say, I don't know what I'm going to do this painting of. And I say, well, what are you interested in? And they say, I don't know. I said, well, do you like to eat? Oh, I love to eat. I said, well, that's what you should make your painting of, what do you love to eat? And then they say, is that art? I say, yeah, that's you. If you like to eat, if you're an athlete, whatever you like to do, that's what your starting point for your work is. So anyway, I couldn't escape my textile roots, apparently. And so I wanted a sort of an armor, which when I talked to somebody in the gallery yesterday, they said, that's not an armor. If you feel it, it's quite heavy. And I sort of thought of it really as an armor, but they said, no, that's a stabilizing effect. Because if it wasn't for that vest, the train would not have an anchor. It wouldn't be able to blow up in the air the way it did. So I thought that was really a good comment. So I don't know what it is, but anyway, it took me forever to make. And then I wanted a wedding veil. And I made this veil on the end. And on the floor, which you can't see here, but you can see in the gallery, there's a fan, an industrial fan. And so I wanted the piece to be, as always, a mixture of male and female. I thought of the fan as very male, very utilitarian. And I thought of the veil as a wedding veil and sort of very female. And as somebody said to me yesterday at the opening, this was my wedding dress maybe I was thinking of. And I had to laugh because Bob and I got married in our bathing suits on a beach. So no, maybe I've always wanted, I must always have wanted a prom dress. I must always have wanted a wedding dress and not known. So the 4 pieces downstairs are something that I had always wanted to do, and that was a portrait of our marriage. This is the wedding part. This is us in our youth, and we've been married a long time, nearly 50 years. It's terrible to think of how long it is. But anyway, it's been very good for both of us, I think. Yeah, I think. This is a detail. And so this is us in our youth getting married. And then this is us in our middle age. And as you age, as we age, as I age, you can feel your body disintegrating. It can't do the things it did when you were young. I think you start to feel that when you're in your late 30s maybe, and then it just, of course, gets worse and worse and worse. So I wanted something that was half animalistic, half human, half male, half female. Too many halves, but anyway, that was the idea. You can see when you go down to the gallery, maybe better, that the chest is flat. This is a cast of Bob's body in the title of the paper. The back of the body, the back of the torso, again has fake fur that I burned. I have a bra. I made a pointy bra out of wire. And this is just hardware cloth, the screening that you use to keep the bugs out on your windows. And I made this bra because I'm interested in fashion as well. And I'm interested in the work of Jean-Paul Gaultier, who was the first person to design this pointed bra for Madonna. And if you recognize the bra, it's because we've all been inundated with Madonna. It's hard to escape. And she made this bra iconic. So the bra is female. The flat chest is male. Here are the spines. This is our body disintegrating, made with Bob's papers, washed and rolled up and burned and sewn on. And there's the hollow back. And there's the bra close up. The skirts are also made from hardware cloth that I took outside, put flat and the area outside my studio, and with a soldering iron, I burned holes, for hours every day for about a week. I just burned these holes to make a textile pattern. So for me, it wasn't enough to have the wire. I had to put a pattern in it. And that was rather tedious. But anyway, the effect is, again, of taking male material and turning it into something more decorative, which I would associate with a woman. This one is called Europa's Radiation Environment and its Effects on the Surface. And of course, the title of that is very seductive, isn't it? And so I wanted to do something that was really burned. And in this case, this represents our old age. I burned the cast. Let's see if it comes up next. There it is. I cast his chest. And these little dots that you see on it are actually diagrams. I think I took diagrams only from several of his papers. And then I burned it heavily. And over it, I wanted to do a drawing. And I wanted to do a three-dimensional drawing, and I used just plain black wire that you get at the hardware store. And I put it onto black screening, sort of twisting it in and out of the holes of the screening. And the skirt is made of the hardware cloth, and there are two skirts there, and if you look closely in the gallery, in one of them I wove the wire in flat, two-dimensionally, and then the other one I wove the wire in so it stuck out more three-dimensionally. Oh, the arms, yeah. Whoops, too fast. Let's see. The arms, yes, well, you can see the arms are not in good shape. The arms are made of the same paper. I make multiples of them, So I took the paper, I measured his arm from his shoulder to his elbow, and then from his elbow to his wrist. And I squished up the papers. I think I put wire down first as an armature, and then put the papers around them, and then burned it so heavily that you can't see the papers at all. But before I burned it, I covered it in a matte medium. The medium is like a glue, and that sort of retards the burning. So the burning sort of dissolves in different ways. And I have discovered that it's not just, it's better to use different types of medium, even using Elmer's glue, because they all have different properties, all those glues, and they burn in different ways. Some melt quickly, some become globby and yellow, some dissolve, and some are just right. So anyway, I use them all at different times. So as I say, this is us in our very old age dying. And Bob was very happy when I made this piece, because he thought finally he was going to heaven. At least if he died, he was going to be an angel and have wings. I don't know about that. But this is Mechanism for Cloud Spreading in the DSMC Model II. He did 2 papers, and then I put wings to sort of describe it. And I tore, in this piece, I tore pieces out of the paper that had his name on them that I liked. I burned it lightly around the edges with a soldering iron. I sewed them all on. Their smaller pieces make up the dress. This is part of what I thought of as an ecclesiastical collar that I put around the neck. It's fastened with Velcro, and then it just falls down the front. And then the wings are done with very heavy wire. And let's see, these are some of the feathers, as people call them. But there you can see on the back of the body, I actually sewed 2 very heavy plastic tubes that you buy in a hardware store, the tubing that's used for I don't know what. And then I jammed the wire from the wings into each tube, and then it sort of, the wing fell down on each side. And that's how it looks. I wanted this piece actually to fly, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. So turning was the next best. So I bought a turning thing and put it in the ceiling. You can see it above it, and then it rotates. So if you look at this piece up close, you can see the science. You can see the name of the author of the paper, Robert E. Johnson, my husband, who is still very much alive. And I have to thank for his body, his mind, the work that he did, all of which has made my work possible. So thank you. If anyone wants to ask any questions, you can ask them from my husband, who's sitting in the back row there. Yes?
Robert, what is cloud spreading?
It's about the interstellar medium. So between the stars, there are what we call clouds. They're not clouds like in the sky.
Can you hear that?
Stand up, Bob.
That's why I'm boring, and that's why she. So it's about the interstellar medium. There's clouds, but over time they spread, and these are the things that eventually collapse and form a sun. So we were trying to model how the clouds in the interstellar medium, that's between different stars, that astronomers see with telescopes, how it evolved and maybe eventually collapsed and formed another star. Yeah.
See how boring he is? Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, I suppose the most obvious question is, after you've made these, can they ever be donned or worn, such as on bonfire night or Guy Fawkes night or anything like that?
I think they'd be too uncomfortable. I didn't make them to be worn, but people who are interested in theatre always say, oh, this would be wonderful on stage. And something I didn't mention is that while we live in New York every fall, I go to dance theatre maybe 4 times a week, and I'm very affected by the theatricality of that, the lighting, not so much the movement of the dance or the theatre part, but by the lighting, by the negative space that the bodies make as they move, by the costumes. So all of that informs my work. But nobody has ever, even the shirt I made for him, I thought, well, he could wear that, but in trying to get him into it, it didn't work. It looks better without him in it anyway.
And just a brief comment, you titled this Appropriating Science, but to me it had the effect of humanizing science. I mean, particularly theoretical astrophysics is so, for most of us, so impossibly complex and abstract and distant, and you have sort of brought it into the realm of human appreciation.
I have been a success in somebody's eyes. But that's a really nice comment. Thank you. It's good.
I'm curious about a technical aspect, which is just the burning of materials, using different items to burn with, and using different glues. Do you wear a mask? Do you have your expired extinguisher there?
Well, I always do it outside, and I always have a bucket of water beside me and lots of cloths. But when you put the glues on paper, and often I glue the back as well as the front, it protects the paper. It certainly burns, but it makes the paper quite strong. I mean, it changes something about the paper and it becomes stiff in many cases. If I try to tear it because I've made a mistake and I want to make a bigger hole, sometimes I can't do it. I have to cut it and then I burn it again to make it irregular. So I just use a plumber's torch. You know what that is? What's another name for a plumber's torch? Acetylene torch. It's the torch that plumbers use when your pipes freeze. they come and you panic because of the thing everywhere. It's just that. You buy it in a hardware store. And I do wear a mask. And if you practice it yourself, just make sure you put glue heavily on the front and the back of the paper. I think that's how they make papers look old, say for the theatre. Because it immediately singes it. And a soldering iron will do it more delicately. And a soldering iron has different points. So you can do it very delicately or quite roughly. Yes?
Art and science in a very literal way. How else do you think that art and science might be combined in the future?
Oh. Well, for a long time, I was working with Bob's work, and I didn't know any artist working with science. But then all of a sudden it became popular. The in thing to do was to have an artist and a scientist working together. You could get grants for that. There were lots of shows for it. And so I thought, great, my moment has come. And so there was a show in New York about 15 years ago, and it asked for proposals and send in your slides, and I did. And I was rejected. I thought, well, that's odd, And then I tried for another show that was asking for it, and they didn't want me either. And I happened to know one of the people on the panel that was accepting proposals, and they said, well, the committee didn't think that your work was really using science in a productive way. And the artists that we have chosen for our show all work with scientists who work in a lab, experimentalists, and they take their work and the scientist then makes it move or makes it do various things. And my work, I mean, you probably can see it sort of makes fun of science in a way. It turns science into, or I try, and he thinks I succeed, to turn science into something different. And so they weren't interested. They thought, they said, well, go and apply for an art show, we're not interested. So I can't answer that really, except that, there are many artists who are very interested in how scientists physically do things, but I am more interested just in the weird words that come out of Bob's papers. When I tear out some of the words, some of them are very sexual and taken out of context. Some of them are very amusing. Some of them mean something totally different from what the scientists thought. So when I am tearing out my selected words from the paper, I'll show them to Bob and he'll laugh and he'll say, oh, I never thought of that. That means this. And I'll say, no, it doesn't. It means that. So, I'm not a good person to promote science. In fact, many of Bob's colleagues, are quite outraged at what I do. And then others of them say, oh, I love it. Would you use my papers? I've done a really neat paper. I say, no, that misses the whole point. It has to be Bob and me working together to make something else.
There's a very unusual feature in all of your figures that I've seen. The heads are missing. I wonder if you have any comments about that.
He says the heads are missing on all my pieces, and he wants me to comment. But I don't know what to say. Yeah, the heads are missing. Well, it's hard. I mean, it's a different thing altogether to cast a head. That takes the emphasis away from the body. And clearly I'm interested in the clothing and in the effects, the patterning effects on the body. And I'm not interested in the head. And of course, Bob his work is all about his head. And so it's probably... Yeah, well, his head is never where his body is. We all make fun of him because, he's pretending that he's listening to you and he looks so intelligent, and then you make a very mundane comment about what you were talking about and he's totally at sea. He's no idea what you'd said. So I think he walks around thinking about his work. But yeah, the heads are missing, and that is sort of deliberate.
Another practical question. How did you cast the whole body? Did you do it in parts and then put them together?
Yeah, how did I cast the whole body? It was horrible doing it. That's why I thought I had to reuse, and I reused lots of all my pieces. Yeah, of course it was worse for Bob than for me. I had to bribe him with, a book on tape, and then he didn't like the book. I had to go and get another one and get it, so it was just what he was interested in. So I propped him up. I would prop up a pile of books maybe and put one arm there, and then I would cast this part with the arm, and then I would put something, tie his arm up to the ceiling and cast that quickly, and then do the rest. And then I had him in parts, and then once it was in parts, I had to, without his body there, I cut him out of it, by the way. I Vaseline the part. Oh yeah. Then I cut him out with an X-Acto knife. That's the fun part. It's not so much that the X-Acto knife hurts him, it's that when you pull away the cast from his body, all the hairs on the body come away, so he's now a hairless man. No. Yeah, it's sort of hard to do. I have to cut him under here and around here and then sort of ease it off. And then, without him there, I hold what casts I have in place with paper, and then I put more plaster bandages to hold the shape. And then I build it up with about 6 layers of pages, bits torn out of his papers, and that strengthens it.
Well, why don't we, if anyone wants to go into the gallery and take a look at the work, then Barbara can answer some questions. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you for so beautifully describing your work.